problem yeah, go ahead.
Fill out.
Classified for net educators in San
I
Francisco.
think a lot of this whole question.
But this will be relaxed with all of my friends. You guys stay.
I'll be right back. Oh, good. Forgot my jacket.
All right. My name is Paul Garber, for those of you that don't know me. This is the labor workshop. Like some of you, I spent most of my life working for some union or another. I worked for the Service Employees International Union in Pittsburgh for 15 years, and then I worked for the International Union of Food Workers globally for 15 years. And since I retired, I've been working politically, but most of my work continues to be international labor. I found a new interest in China, and I've been doing a lot of work with Chinese activists, mainly through solidarity groups in Hong Kong, like Hong Kong 21, and the SACO, which is the NGO that has been very helpful in helping Chinese workers organize themselves. So I along with Dwayne and Stu, who are here, we are the co-editors of Talking Union, which is DSA's labor blog, which is very prolific. We wish it were as widely read as it is prolific, but Stu's been working very hard, Dwayne, to get it onto, get it reposted and retweeted. Okay, so that's basically it. You don't want to hear any more from me. I will feel free, though, to mention my own experience, but I thought rather than have long speeches, including my own, I was going to ask a few questions to our two panelists. And I will introduce them very briefly. They are introduced in our program, so I don't need to tell you everything. But Angie kept hers short, so I can say that she's a recruiter for the National Nurses United, which is originated, and the California Nurses Association, which is its biggest affiliate. She's a teacher of Asian American Studies and a former member of the San Francisco School Board. Her first union was the farm workers. Then you organized community support programs for HERE in San Francisco and Oakland, and is a former chair of the DSA youth section, which is apparently quite useful for jobs with National Nurses United, as we know from Michael Lighty. However, that doesn't mean they don't have to work very long. I don't know what to say about my friend Steve Early. I won't say very much.
The less the better.
Just buy his book. He said, well, what's the most important thing? Steve is not only a labor staffer for many years, an organizer, a confidant of Larry Cohen, CWA. I mean, I know that he worked very closely in helping to build the CWA into one of our best unions. He also is a prolific journalist and writer. He writes books. I can't keep up with his books. I can just barely read them, and I'm starting to review them by the time the next one comes out. I don't know how he does this. I think they do recycle some of his earlier articles.
Retirement helped.
Yes. Well, redeployment, you always call
That's
it,
right.
Steve. Steve said he's not retired, he's redeployed. And I've been using that ever since because I realized that's how I think of myself. Not as retired, but as redeployed. So I won't tell you anything more about Steve. He'll tell you about himself. He will reveal himself. But I will say one more thing about Steve. He argues with everyone, usually to their face, which is good. And he's a member of every good left-wing organization I know of. And I think including DSA, I think he paid it.
I was a member of DSOC and NAM in the 70s. So
See,
I was the vanguard, the unity movement.
He
Joined this organization.
He joins everything, and he's what I call a left ecumenical person, but not by being bland. I can tell you that. Okay, so what I want to ask Angie and Steve first is how they got into the labor movement. This is a short story. Give me the short story, Angie. I just want to go very quickly through this, and so we can share all that experience. So I just asked Angie and Steve just to describe why they got involved in the labor movement. What's the first thing they did?
I was lucky. I came of age at a time when the United Farm Workers was asking all kinds of people to help farm workers, and my friends and I were in high school, and a bunch of us decided to graduate a year early to go to work for the United Farm Workers Union. And that work continued for me throughout college, and then even after college, when people that I had met through working in the farm workers went into revitalizing and rebuilding the hotel and restaurant union. And it was a really interesting mix of community organizing and pre-union organizing that Caesar did before the United Farm Workers became a union, which helped to revitalize and regenerate all kinds of changes throughout the country in labor councils and established unions, but especially in the hotel and restaurant union, where I had the tremendous opportunity to build community support programs for Local 2 in San Francisco and 2850 in Oakland, taking everything that we learned in the Farm Workers Union to involve more people in the community in the struggle of workers.
Steve?
I think my trajectory into the labor movement was similar to that of some folks in this room who were active in the late 60s, perhaps, in the anti-war movement. I was a college anti-war activist in Vermont. Like many of us, when we organized those big teach-ins against the war, we had to find somebody from a union to come and speak. And back then, that was often difficult. In Vermont at the time, strangely enough, the United Electrical Workers, our well-known independent left-wing union, was the largest industrial union in the state, so we actually did succeed in getting some UE leaders to come and mingle with the student-based anti-war movement in Vermont at the time. And I was very much influenced by a guy named Jimmy Kane, who came out of Springfield, Vermont, the machine tool industry, later became the regional UE president and the national president of the UE. Back in the early 70s, for someone graduating from college with no credentials other than having been an anti-war agitator, the unions were not rolling out the red carpet at the time to hire people. They didn't have recruiters like Angie, you know, posting jobs on the internet, come work for us. There was a lot of paranoia about left-wing student activists. There were no workers' centers to go to work for as an alternative to unions back then. So many people did something that we'll talk about later. They went and got a job and joined a union or formed a union. Like several of my colleagues in this room, I took the path of lesser resistance and went to law school, thinking that that credential would open some doors to me in Washington, D.C. As it turned out, very luckily, I was able to get involved in a reform movement in the United Mine Workers in the early 1970s, got my first full-time union job while still in law school, working for the United Mine Workers after the Miners for Democracy took over in 1972, and worked with several other union democracy and reform struggles in the 70s, and then, as Paul said, from 1980 to 2007, ended up working mainly in the Northeast as an organizer and international rep for CWA.
And I'll answer my own question. I was sitting in a New American Movement chapter meeting in Pittsburgh in 1974, and one of my comrades said, I just saw an ad in the paper looking for hospital worker organizers. SEIU was advertising. And 3 of us applied for and got the job. And when I was interviewed by the union executive board, who I didn't know, they didn't know me, they said, well, why do you think you can do this? I said, well, I've been in the anti-war movement, and I've faced police confrontation, and I've taken risks. And they said, you're just what we want. They didn't care what my politics were. But anyway, so it became I became organizer, and then through some of the unusual things. The exciting part was jumping to the international level and doing that for a while. That's another story. But it does seem like people have different routes. I guess the takeaway is there are lots of ways to do it, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about we had to debate even then within the New American Movement about, together with the IS, because we were in the same organization for a while. Do you get a staff job, or do you know, or do you have to go work on the floor first? And of course, the old industrial union tradition was, you know, you had to come up through the ranks, or you were just a specialist that never had any political thing in the union. The good and bad part about SEIU, as many of you know, is that the two are totally merged, and they really don't give a damn where you come from. In fact, very few SEIU leaders actually come from the industry in which they got their first job. So I think that there are lots of, Steve's written a book about this, or at least, I don't know if the book is out, that book is out yet, but you've interviewed a lot of people about that experience, so we could talk a little bit more about what are the conflicting, or what's the relationship between people that take full-time union staff jobs and those who are. Okay, I'll go to the second question, and I'll start with Steve this time. So what's the most, you've learned a lot over these 30 or 40 years. What do you think is the most important thing a couple things you learned?
Patience, I guess. And given the, you know, the steady and sad, tragic decline of the labor movement over the last 40 years, a little bit of optimism of the will helps to overcome the pessimism of the intellect that it's hard not to have when, you know, along with thousands of other folks on the left, our generation, and we have an incredible range of experience here from the 60s generation and the 30s generation. You know, we went into the labor movement to bring about big changes, and it's been a huge struggle just to hold the line, to wage defensive struggles and not lose more ground, which has been, unfortunately, the statistical story, the bottom line of our efforts over the last 4 decades. So, you know, I think I've seen a lot of people burn out as a result of their labor work, not always due to their own fault. You know, particularly some of the unions who, to their credit, like the hotel workers, the SEIU, and some of the others in recent years that have been more open to hiring young people, they've really chewed them up and spit them out. And a lot of people have had, you know, very bruising personal experiences working as organizers, as staff people, as researchers in all kinds of capacities. And I think, you know, that's not a good model. Those of us who are in this room, what Staunton Lynn calls long-distance runners, you know, that's what you got to be. This is not a sprint. Would counsel young people to take the long-term view and would support their efforts to try to find institutional settings that are not going to manage by churn, right? That are going to cultivate the capacities of indigenous militants, people out of the rank and file, people from community organizations, people from campus organizations, but are not going to work them to death so that, you know, in a year or two, they quit, go back to graduate school, get off the labor track, you know, do any number of other things, but are lost to the movement building that we've all been engaged in, and which we know instinctively is a long-term effort, not a short-term turnaround job.
Now, you can't say patience, you have to say
I've got 3 lessons.
Okay.
The first lesson is that no good organizing is ever lost. As I think about the kinds of work that people have done over the years, that whole experience of standing up to authority for the first time, the whole experience of being on a picket line, the whole experience of being part of something greater than yourself, that changes people. And that's a change that continues with them for the rest of their lives. And then when I look at movements and organizations and unions as institutions, you just see how it is that the unions have been rebuilt and revitalized through the social movements, and that good work continues in different forms. I think of some of the Labor Council, for example, in Los Angeles, which was headed by someone who at one point got his start as, you know, in the farm workers union, came up through Miguel Contreras is who I'm thinking about. And just the whole way in which the United Farm Workers revitalized the labor community throughout the country in many different ways like that. That just, you start out on one project like getting contracts for a small group of farm workers, and you end up doing things like influencing the development of a new union movement and revitalizing and rebuilding unions that need to be built. The second lesson is that I've learned recently is that you do have a choice in terms of which union you work for, and you don't necessarily have to leave your politics behind when you go to work for a union. It used to be that I had friends who worked for unions, and I've been in situations with unions where election day comes along and I go up to my director, gee, can I take a day off? Because I really don't want to have to go out and campaign for so-and-so. And some staff directors would let me kind of, call in sick on that one day because I had friends in the lesbian and gay community who were backing someone and the union was backing someone else. And I've learned that you can work for a union if you're going to do union staff jobs where you don't have to bury your politics, where your politics are an asset. And that's been a real joy. And the third thing that I've learned is that when change does come, it can come incredibly quickly. I was sent by the United Farm Workers to San Francisco as an organizer in 1976, and I think it was 16 years later that I was on the school board voting to name a school after Cesar Chavez, that when change does come, it really comes much quicker than we would have thought possible within just my short lifetime. That I would see those changes that quickly, that Caesar would be somebody that we'd be naming schools after and teaching our kids about in school.
Did you walk your own precinct?
For the other candidate.
Well, we have a little option here. We can talk a little bit about this part of it, because the third question I'm going to ask him is what do they think the most significant contribution we as DSA or we as activists can make in the next few years to our common goals. I think we can assume we all have. I don't think we need to discuss it. I mean, we all have spent most of our lives either doing or thinking about how we can contribute to the struggle of working people, for a good society and for a better life. Does anybody want to do you want to talk about this first thing, or do you want to go straight to I'll tell you what, let me ask that question, and then you can say anything you want about anything earlier. And I'll start with Angie this time. Now, there's a lot of things we all know we need to do, right? But what do you think are the crucial things that we can contribute to in the next few years?
I think that DSA can really play a role in terms of the underlying political education that needs to be done, to letting people know that there are alternatives, that there is a certain standard of living that people have a right to expect, that people who work hard do have a right to expect that they can provide for their families, have a safe place to live, that people who work hard should realize that they've got the right to have their kids have a decent education, that people who work hard should know that it's not their fault that they can't, when they can't provide for these things, that there's a larger system that's keeping them from really being able to get ahead. And it's that political education, I think, that's important. The second thing that I think that DSA can do is when there are labor struggles, to really be standing on support of the unions and explaining why it is. We recently went through a BART strike here in the Bay Area, and things got very, very bitter, and people were saying, why do these workers need X, Y, and Z? I don't even have X, Y, and Z, and somebody needs to do the education and say, we all deserve X, Y, and Z. And the bottom line should be for everybody X, Y, and Z. And it used to be that people had expectations, that they had health care, and that they had retirement benefits, and they could be secure in providing for their families. And there's nothing wrong with this, and we should all have this, and we should all support everyone to have this. And the third thing that I wanted to talk about in the long term is my union is working on the Robin Hood tax, which would change things in how financial institutions are taxed in this country, so that we could have $350 billion a year to provide health care and social service and jobs for people in this country, and also do some things that people outside this country need and don't get right now. And it's just all by taxing the corporations, and it's that long-range campaign as well. that I wanted to ask for your help in.
Okay, and just to point out, I mean, DSA has, of course, endorsed this and put out some literature on it, but I think we have not, in general, found very effective ways to work around it. I think that's a campaign problem that you know, we have to confront with anything we do. But all the things, the other things you said, I mean, they're all things that people are around you all the time, around us all the time, and do that. Steve, you want to take on the same question?
Sure. I would second everything Angie just suggested, to add a little spice and variety to the recipe, and this reflects my own longstanding bias. I think there's a lot that socialists can do, still need to do, to help support internal union struggles for union democracy and reform. You know, there are some people understandably look at the besieged state of our fortress unions today and say, hey, we really can't afford to have, you know, internal union fights. The external enemies are too great. Kind of overlooks the fact that when members have problems and they're feeling ill-served by their own organization, they try to use whatever tools they have in terms of hopefully democratic procedures within the union to change the leadership, to change the course and direction of the union, as a number of longtime activists and the postal workers have recently done. Very, very exciting development, covered very well in the latest issue of Labor Notes. My personal hero is a guy who may even outrank Oscar and Bernie in seniority, Herman Benson, who's divided the second half of his long, nearly century-long life to the cause of the Association for Union Democracy. He personally and the AUD have helped innumerable rank-and-file activists in all kinds of unions, from the building trades to the miners in the 60s, the painters in San Francisco in the late 50s and early 60s, the steelworkers, every imaginable dissident group has turned to the AUD at one point or another. So that is one cause that I think socialists should not ignore. You know, socialists have played a very important role in sustaining Labor Notes as an alternative labor media outlet and labor education project over close to 35 years. Socialists founded, in many ways, were the core founders of the Teamsters for Democratic Union, which has had a very positive impact, in my view, on the functioning of the Teamsters Union. Still troubled, but working better than it used to. And, you know, you see socialists in successful reform struggles, the New York State nurses, a lot of the places, the Chicago teachers, you know, the caucus of reformers that took over the CTU several years ago, did intensive restructuring the union, membership mobilization, outreach to the community, had one of the few recent successful large-scale strikes. You know, there's a core of socialist activists there, mainly in the ISO, but from other groups who've had a tremendously constructive impact on that AFT big city local, and I think have provided a model for transformation of the union elsewhere that hopefully is inspiring more teacher union activists. So I think the very exemplary role of socialist activists from Herman Benson on down, a long distinguished list, in supporting movements for union democracy and reform. They're still going to be needed in some unions, and I think part of our job, as controversial as it is sometimes, to get behind those efforts.
Now, I promised to throw one hardball to Steve. He knew it was coming. Steve's had a little public controversy, which is not unusual, with Bill Fletcher and Jeff Crosby in Labor Notes mainly, about what happened at the AFL-CIO convention, what the significance of it is. Peter Olney from, I don't know if he's still long-term.
He's the organizing director.
Yeah, for the ILWU out here. It's a very interesting question. The question is the AFL-CIO making enough in its talk about more coalitions and advocating for the working class as a whole? Is that a half full glass or a half empty glass if it's not accompanied with an attempt to get its affiliates to become more democratic and represent their existing members better. I don't know if I put it correctly. I just asked you to comment on that because I think people should read all of this. And by the way, look at the literature table. Steve has a lot of good stuff on there, including back copies of labor notes, which I've been reading for, is it 40 years?
Started in 1979, so definitely
not quite 40
an
years.
institutional long-distance runner.
35 years. And which I don't always agree with, but I always find stimulating, and I've kept my subscription for those 35 years. He has I think your essay on salting, is this the one in Working Union?
Working USA, yeah.
Yeah, I recommend that you, especially young people who might be thinking about how to relate, I would definitely encourage looking at that article, especially if you're a young person, looking at the question of what kinds of entry point can you have to the working class struggle. I haven't read I read the short version and thought that now I'm happy to have the long version. I plan to read it. But again, we could comment a little bit. Maybe what about the alt-labor stuff and the attempt to organize, not so much for collective bargaining rights, but to organize groups of workers? Are there any comments about that? Maybe?
Actually, I was going to comment on the previous stuff.
Okay, comment on that first.
I think a lot of this whole question of democracy in the labor movement, most unions have formally democratic structures and formally democratic procedures. And it's as much as anything else a question of sort of creating a democratic culture within an organization. And I was here in San Francisco for a long time, and I left 7 years ago. I'm a little out of touch with what's going on presently, but at least as of the time I left, I would contrast the San Francisco Labor Council with the Los Angeles Labor Council. The San Francisco Labor Council was, in many ways, very left-wing. And you could get the San Francisco Labor Council to pass a resolution supporting any revolution going on anywhere in the world at the drop of a hat. But the way that the council did business, that it was very much steeped. It was like the land that time forgot. It was this sort of 1950s style thing where if something was really important to the council, well, the secretary treasurer of the council would go have breakfast with the mayor, and they'd work it out, and the problem would disappear in some way or another. Whereas the LA Council, which I don't think had anywhere near as ideological left an orientation, but under Miguel Contreras and Mary Elena, it's really turned into the central engine that drives progressive politics in LA County, and has become sort of the center of mobilizing immigrant communities politically, and it has contributed enormously to changing the political makeup of Los Angeles in a very positive way. And it's not like I say, it's not because of more or less democratic structures or procedures, but it's created a much more, it's about creating a more democratic and participatory culture where people are engaged and committed to that work.
Okay. Anybody want to comment on the? Okay.
Okay, I was going to follow up on the question, the original question that you asked, which was, what can DSA do? And I put down some ideas. It seems to me, from my perspective, that the major thing, and I always get in trouble when I express my ideas, so I'm ready for any kind of attack here. It seems the major thing is that DSA ought to coalesce with unions, and that coalition should take place on specific campaigns. and that specifically I'm talking here about boycotts and endorsing strikes and providing, in connection with that, I would talk about providing educational alternatives, as the woman here spoke about, presenting educational / policy alternatives of a socialist orientation overtly. And I would also suggest that, as the gentleman here spoke, that part and parcel of that is to help foster campaigns to democratize internally within unions. And that would, I think what becomes problematic for that, and I experienced this as a staff person in a union, is when you start to, if you think as a staff person, you can start to initiate that. I think you need to be very careful about that as a staff person, coming down on high. And I think having been a union member, alternatively, I know that you're in a very different position to present alternatives for democratization. And I think there's a role there. And I think that you talked about how back in the old days people used to join unions or start working someplace and then join the union. And I think that's a strategy we still ought to look at. I think that's still a valid strategy. And then finally, I think what we've already established, I think, is that it's useful for, as individuals, for each of us to look at ways in which we can organize in unions.
Okay, thanks. Dave?
I think, to be perfectly honest, I never joined DSA till the day after I retired. I come from a conservative union, and they didn't have room for that. What I did in my own time was okay, but don't have a formal relationship. The reality to me is, I think my brother's right, the comrade's right. Salting is an extremely positive way to go. From my background, you have to have an apprenticeship, you have to be trained, but in a lot of unions, obviously teaching won't work either, unless you have a certification. But my brothers and sisters in SEIU and hotel workers and stuff like that have been successful. I've used salting in hotels to get people that have maintenance experience into a hotel to talk about the merits of bargaining collectively and how we can change things. So I think that's the number one thing we can support them. And that's the nice thing about having young people here, is to talk to them there is. And I'm looking forward to reading the article. I think what we can do, and it's already been said, but I have to reiterate it again, that educate. He's on the board of our Detroit DSA. Phil Sloop used to tell me that we're so successful that we've made Republicans out of most of our members, or a lot of our members, you know. And if you think about it, it's really, really true. And I'm not big on labor notes. I'm not big on the idea that it's all right to raid somebody else. And that's my history, 45 years in the union. So I mean, I have to say, I'm not comfortable with that. I know that there's bad locals. I know that I don't know if there's any really bad unions as such, but there are bad locals, you know, in just about every union. But I still don't think to me, the AFL-CIO, that's one of the roles of the AFL-CIO. They should be knocking on their heads and saying, "Wake up, folks! You're going to lose big bargaining units or whatever." So I should shut up. But this works. This works. DSA works, and I think the best way is to learn from these conferences and the DSA programs we put on in Detroit and elsewhere. We can reach out to people. I brought two UAW retirees to our last, and they said they'd like to join if they could just change the name. You know, if they would just change the name. If they just take socialists out of the work, they join in a second because they love who we are.
say on this political assaulting thing?
Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I
Can
think.
you define it, can you define, I don't know what
Yeah.
that is.
Define it.
Funny? Oh, well, that's a snake pit I found. Okay, very quickly, I'd say the old left term, right, from the Communist Party, the 30s, colonizing, it's not something that's understood quite so clearly today, but that's how people thought of themselves when from radical parties in the 30s, they went and got jobs and tried to build a CIO. More recently, as the brother here from the operating engineers said, the term that's more common in the construction industry is salting, the union encouraging people who are union-minded, who have a card to kind of go in and work from the inside to organize non-union contractors, which was not the traditional approach, but one that the trades have been forced to take more in recent years, given the hostile climate. The younger folks that are doing this with the sponsorship of Unite Here are told to never use either term and only think of themselves as being interns, which is kind of a funny euphemism when you go from being a graduate of Fordham, which was one of the folks that I profiled or interviewed, a USAS activist, to being a bellhop at a fancy Ritz-Carlton hotel in Pasadena for 4 years while you were building an underground organizing committee. That's a long internship. At least it was paid. But, for legal reasons, they use that term. You talk to folks in the IWW who've done this at Starbucks and some other places. You know, they talk about peer-to-peer organizing. They have their own terminology for it. But essentially it is getting a job, hopefully in conjunction with some compatible union. And if it's a non-union workplace, working as people tried to do more in unionized workplaces in the 70s to help bring people together, form an organizing committee, work with the outside staff, and hopefully be part of a successful campaign for bargaining rights, or to build a non-majority union in the current approach at our Walmart and some other places where the goal of unionization is more long-term than short-term. I think, the thing to learn from the experience of the 70s, which I try to get at a little bit in the article, is, the left groups were very rigid, overly rigid in the 70s, right? They all were pushing their people, whether they were the Maoists, the Communists, the Trots, into heavy industry. People who came from middle and upper middle class university backgrounds were offered, put under incredible political pressure to become something they were not. They probably, in many cases, would have lasted longer, had more of an impact, played a more comfortable union role if they'd stayed on the track that some of them later got back on and became unionized teachers, social workers, nurses, adjuncts, union members, professional and technical engineers in white-collar jobs, and in the private sector where unions are really light and need more bulking up. A lot of people got off track because of this, last century notion that the only real workers were blue-collar workers. You had to be in heavy industry. We had to transform these key sector unions. A lot of people got deindustrialized out of a job. Within 10 or 15 years, some they managed to get a pension in a few places, but it was like being the last survivor of the Japanese Army's occupation of the Pacific Islands. Is there anybody else in the jungle there that wants to surrender? But today, with fast food, hey, a young person struggling to find a job, lots of places where you could get a job in some of these cities where Fight for 15 is trying to build some kind of movement, could play an inside role as opposed to going the route of getting a full-time job with a union or a workers' center where you can play a very valuable role, get good experience. But the experience of working first and building the union from the inside is really invaluable, I think, based on the stories that I was able to collect from a number of people who've done that in the hotel industry, in the bike messenger industry in San Francisco, in the wireless telecom industry, which was a CWA case study, and then Starbucks, the IWW's skirmishing with them is fairly legendary at this point.
I'll call on Barbara in a minute. I just want to directly related to this. The salt, they don't call it salt, but there has been a tradition in many countries of radical activists, intellectuals, taking jobs especially under repressive regimes. I mean, some of my best comrades in Spain were communists and socialists who ideologically formed as, you know, took industrial jobs under Franco and worked, you know, within the factories and the you know, the fascist-dominated unions to develop. And when they came out and emerged after the dictatorship, they were, you know, they were hardened, tough, smart, you know, people who could run a union. And I think I've seen Latin America, just for survival, a lot of former guerrillas, they went into industrial work. Some of them found it very dangerous. Some of my best comrades in IUF were killed. You know, people we hired or worked with because, you know, they got identified, or the right wing, you know, they got on some list, hit list, and got killed. So it's, I don't want to make it sound dramatic, because usually you won't be killed in the U.S. But you may not have the career, if you do decide to work at Walmart or McDonald's or whatever, you may not have the career prospects that you might have if you found some other kind of area. So it's a tough decision. But I think in principle, it's the employer cannot be so easily identified these days, because the fact is that a lot of college graduates are taking jobs that are well beneath their normal, you know, what you would normally expect just because of the job market. So in some ways, it's a time it is a time to get experience. And I think that, again, I think people should think very carefully about that as an alternative to the other route, which I did, of becoming a paid outside worker. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity,
Oh, yeah, Barbara.
is salting something that unions support structurally? Like, if you decide to go in if you decide to like get hired at McDonald's and like try to salt at McDonald's, are you working with a union who's teaching you organizing skills, or is it sort of like?
Steve, you should-
Well, the hotel workers, I think, have the most elaborate program of recruiting people, training them, supporting them, and I could put you in touch with there's a New Haven-based guy who helps place people. And, you know, there's some pro and con views in that piece of what the relationship is between an HERE SALT and their outside handlers and supporters in different local union situations, which, you know, as Tim said, you know, Los Angeles is different from San Francisco, and both are different from New York. So you have to check out the local support network. You know, the IWW, with many fewer resources, did recruit a lot of young people to take jobs for however long they
They're
could
doing
last.
that
at
at right now at a bakery.
Yeah, and I think the momentum and the high-profile excitement of the fast food campaign has really opened up a lot of vistas. A very good piece that we just done the last couple of days, posted at Jacobin, a young woman who's working at Whole Foods in Chicago and has attached her little group of co-workers to the fast food campaign in Chicago, even though I'm sure it was not on the original radar screen as of one of the fast food franchises that they were concentrating on. So yeah, if you don't want to be totally isolated and alone and kind of on your own, you'd want to pick a city, pick a union context where there's going to be a social safety net and some other people doing it, do it with some friends. And I think that makes it more viable. You know, there are some unions years ago that actually used to subsidize this. I guess that was when Treasury's more
We did.
flush. I went to
We
law
did.
school at the time.
I did, yeah.
His first job out of law school was going to work for New England 1199 in a non-union hospital in Worcester. You know, emptying bedpans, and 1199 in New York sent him a little check every month to make up the difference between what would have been his outside organizer pay and his entry-level hospital worker pay. I see less of that going on today, but as Paul said, because of the terrible downward mobility in our society, I run across fewer instances of, you know, people getting snagged for resume falsification, which used to be an issue in the 70s when people were kind of rewriting or blanking out those 4 years they spent at Harvard or Radcliffe before
Being
they
in jail was better than being in the college.
went to get a job at Cambion in Cambridge.
Barbara's been very
Well,
patient.
yeah, I was sort of expecting a somewhat broader discussion, in light of the, you know, obvious turn of events at the recent AFL-CIO convention and so on. But I just want to mention a couple of other things too. that are a little different from what we've been talking about. In Atlanta, we have on the community radio station, twice a week, a labor program. I don't know how many others there are. It's underwritten by the Progressive Teamsters local and sometimes some other groups. But it's not run by them at all. In fact, the person who does it is a member of a sectarian group, but she keeps her politics under wraps. It's really very good. It used to be done by someone else. Anyway, so that's an interesting thing to explore in terms of public education. Use your community or college radio station, probably not your NPR station. And the other thing is Jobs with Justice. That's what my group, my DSA group, has been focusing on for the last few years with a tremendous amount of success in terms of, I mean, it's a very vibrant, active, and exciting Jobs with Justice coalition. Not all cities have that kind of JWJ. And DSA is quite well known for having been instrumental in reviving it actually in Atlanta, and serving on the organizing committee. Our chair is a treasurer. So that was one way to go. That's how I learned about, really I knew very little about the labor movement in spite of some background stuff. And that's how I've really actually had the opportunity to work with some amazing people that I really enjoyed and felt we were making a contribution in the otherwise rather depressing Atlanta, situation.
Great. You first. I forgot your name, sorry.
Bernie.
Bernie, okay.
Well, somewhat depressing history as I can draw upon. Detroit, with its 100,000 tool and die workers and dressaging automation, which they did, it's the largest collection of professional, high-skilled workers. That wasn't hard industry, and it was basically determined what we call co-determination, worker participation in the ownership. It was the underpinning of the Reuther brothers, and they became the target of the Communist Party, who were willing to work with management, in effect, deal with Mother Russia. At the same token, here in San Francisco, we have that good Republican, Harry Bridges, who pushed the socialists out of his union, the ones who actually did the organizing and the work. So there is an ideological fracture between top-down, shall we say, enabling, and those who work with social democracy. And I did the same with the TUC, by the way, Trade Union Council, in London, with Margaret Mackay. Do you remember any of that? Before your time.
So you had the experience of that battles between socialists and communists within the labor movement.
Yes, that was the important thing. It wasn't just working in foundries and in the mines. These were highly skilled workers with Sprisage, are dealing with Silicon Valley and the highly skilled workers, where there is an opening for bringing workers together, highly skilled ones, high-paid ones, to work together, what we would call cooperatives, co-determination, and other forms of keeping democracy and putting vitality back in unions and not just being public representation people.
Stu, were you on the
Yeah, I think
5
a
minutes.
little, did they just give us a 5-minute warning?
I 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna switch what I was gonna say then. Paul and Dwayne and I have been the editorial team for the Talking Union blog, but we feel like
Steve's done it for us, so.
we feel like there's more that ought to be done. That we ought to have more of a structure that might do things like using the Google Hangouts or DSA software to have some conversations with some people, some expertise. And so what I'd like people to do, if that's something that you would like to be involved with, on just a sheet of paper on the pad here, put your name, email if you use email, and phone number and your area, and that'll help us after the convention to maybe move forward on some exciting stuff.
Promise you'll get back.
Stuart?
Last
Okay,
30
look-
years, I've done, this will be my third time in 30 years I've done this, and no one's contacted.
Let me
I'm not
give,
blaming you guys.
let me give you, the email for Talking Union is talkingunion@gmail.com.
It's coming around.
It's coming
Yeah, I
around.
got it here.
And then who do you want to get these?
Oh,
Yeah,
Uh,
so Stuart, instead of a list, all you do is.
oh yeah, fill out on this, that would be better.
And then, do we give them to you, Dwayne?
But so now that we got that done, my other thought was that I think our youth section and others ought to be also thinking about the expansion of Working America, which is the community group. It's been mainly an electoral canvas, and it will probably still be that, but they're trying to do some alt-labor organizing. And they also have a plan to go to all 50 states, and it's either 5 or 10 years. I saw the ad on Facebook with a $35,000 starting salary.
Definitely hiring.
So that's another thing, and it may not be a long-term thing, but it may be a good experience for people.
I just want to make sure people understand what Stu is asking people to do. Our discussion was how do we try to create a bigger forum within DSA for people to exchange experiences, maybe for young people who are having their first involvements to have a network they can join. And we will look at the technology about how to not just have people be passive recipients of Talking Union, but for maybe monthly forums or call-ins or something. So that's what we're asking if people are interested in coming around. Is there anyone who hasn't spoken? Because we have very few. You have.
Nice layout, no union bug, and there's no such thing as labor donated.
Amen to that, amen to that.
This administration is not
Yeah.
post offices and not putting their money back in.
Right.
In Michigan, where the unions
Big
have been, under attack in the last couple of years by the state legislature, there is a move,
We have
I
people
think
that
mainly encouraged by Steve Babson to promote social unionism, where the unions get more involved in their communities to build support so that they're better equipped to withstand that kind of onslaught from the legislature. So that is something that people could also do in helping unions get connected with their networks of community organizations. In Detroit, I think some unions have been involved in the foreclosure prevention and eviction prevention programs there.
Steve Babson. I'll take Dwayne and then Dave.
I would just, one thing we might want to discuss at a future time, like on the web or something, is the question that Tim brought up, because I and other people have had that experience of being in labor councils that could pass every resolution, as opposed to labor councils that do something, and I think we ought to discuss that, because it's.
A good thing or a bad thing to push for more public disclosure on the part of public sector unions, because that's where the membership is. Right now, public sector unions, to my understanding, don't have to file the LM2s. And so the members of those unions are paying dues, they don't know where that money is going. And they're massive court fights over, gee, where are my dues going, what's the union doing? On the one hand, you could see how you could build an effective campaign in this climate to force public unions to disclose the way every other union has to in terms of union democracy. On the other hand, your allies are likely to be the right.
Yeah.
But I think union members have that right to know, and the unions that are public sector are not disclosing.
Angie, I'm not so sure that many public sectors aren't, because so many public sector unions and private sector, and they all.
I can name you the ones that I've looked for, and they're not there. And then I start Googling, and their members are suing them for this information. And maybe it's a bad thing.
The NEA resisted for decades, for instance.
I would only say this is one of those questions that we probably can't solve in the next 30 seconds. It's very important. Steve, you have a-
But I think it does relate to the crisis that the sister here touched on with her story of being laid off as a staff person for a public sector union in the Midwest. I mean, the unions that have been stripped of dues checkoff or, broader scope of bargaining rights in Ohio and Wisconsin, Michigan, private sector in Indiana, are really struggling to reshape themselves as voluntary dues-paying membership organizations. So whether or not they're compelled to, live up to the disclosure standards of the Lanham-Griffin Act, they should be a lot more transparent, because in more and more states, they're not going to be able to depend, it would appear, current open shop trends continue, on union security clauses to guarantee the kind of stream of dues money that keeps people employed servicing them. The unions are going to have to rely more on the members, rank and file initiative, and they're going to have to be responsive, because when people are given a choice whether or not to pay dues, in a lot of these states in the Midwest recently, even Wisconsin, after the Great Uprising, membership levels plummeted. And it's a tremendous internal organizing challenge throughout the Midwest to get that back up.
I have the sad obligation to end this, because I will get in deep trouble if we don't go back to